1 second. And we are live.
Good evening. I'm Scott Harris, Executive Director of Museums at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to a program from one of our institutions, the James Monroe Museum. Tonight we will have two experts discussing a remarkable effort to document to the greatest extent possible the experience of both the enslaved in American history as well as enslavers and the related circumstances surrounding that terrible and tragic relationship that has defined so much of American history and continues to resonate in our popular culture today. Enslaved.org, the Peoples of the Historical Slave Trade, has to date amassed something over 1 million records and is continuing to add to a database that seeks to be as comprehensive as possible on this topic. And we're very fortunate to have the two principal investigators with us this evening to talk about their work. A little bit of housekeeping, as we always do. We thank our sponsors, the Friends of the James Monroe Museum, for making this and all of our public programs possible, both virtual and in person. We invite you to go to the James Monroe Museum's Facebook page to stay abreast of upcoming programs. Also, our website, jamesmonroemuseum.umw.edu. And then also this program, as well as many others that we've previously done, are archived on the James Monroe Museum's YouTube channel. So you can visit there and see in a few days this program. For our speakers tonight, one more housekeeping detail. As we go along, once the program's going on, you're welcome to submit questions for our speakers in the chat section. Lindsay Crawford, our public programs coordinator for the museum, will be fielding those, passing them on to me to pose those questions to our speakers. So we invite you to do that. We will do that at the end of their presentation. So we'll gather them together and do the questions at the end. So to our speakers tonight, Walter Hawthorne is Professor of African American History at Michigan State University and co-principal investigator on enslaved peoples of the historical slave trade. He's also an editor of the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation. His research focuses on the history of the Atlantic slavery and the changes in African agricultural practices, religious beliefs, and family structures in the Old and New Worlds. His first book, Planting Rice and Harvesting Slaves, Transformations Along the Guinea-Bissau Coast, 1400 to 1900, explores the impact of interactions with the Atlantic and particularly slave trading on small-scale decentralized societies. His second recent book, From Africa to Brazil, Culture, Identity, and an Atlantic Slave Trade, 1600 to 1830, examines the slave trade from West Africa to Amazonia, Brazil. Hawthorne is heavily involved in digital scholarship and has partnered with Matrix, which is MSU's Digital Humanities Center, for several projects. Among other things, Hawthorne and the Matrix team have completed work on a British Library-funded archival digitization project in the Gambia and on 2 National Endowment for the Arts sponsored projects, Slave Biographies, the Atlantic Database Network, and Islam and Modernity. With generous funding from the Mellon Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities, Hawthorne and the Matrix team are currently developing Enslaved.org. The project has led to the creation of this unique online data hub that is changing the way scholars and the public understand African slavery, indeed the purpose of tonight's discussion. Data published through the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation is made searchable and with tools that are available on the Enslaved.org platform. Our other principal investigator, Darrell Williams, who earned his PhD from Stanford in 1995, is Professor of History and serves as Dean of the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences at the University of California, Riverside. Before joining that university, Williams was a faculty member of the Department of History at the University of Maryland, also serving as Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs in the College of Arts and Humanities, and Associate Director of the David C. Driscoll Center. Williams is the other co-principal investigator of Enslaved.org, and he and Walter will be our presenters this evening. Darrell Williams is also a scholar of Latin American history, specializing in 19th and 20th century Brazil and digital slavery studies. He's held grants and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Fulbright and Ford Foundations, and the Rockefeller Humanities Fellowship Program, and from the Maryland Institute for Technology in the Humanities. So we have two scholars this evening who are incredibly well versed not only in the history of this era and of the enslaved, but also heavily invested in the technology of helping bring it to you. And so without further ado, gentlemen, take it away.
Thank you, Scott. Thank to you and everyone at the James Monroe Museum and also University of Mary Washington for inviting us to join you. Walter and I and many others have been working on this project, as I'll talk a little bit more, for a couple of years. But recently, we've really intensified our efforts and engagements with histories of enslavement and the lives of the enslaved in Virginia. And so I think some of this will be of interest specifically to your Virginia location, but also more broadly as you touched on broader questions of resonance historically and today in the United States and globally as well. So what I think I will do, if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if this works. Yes, and then go here. Here we go. And slideshow. Good. I'm going to spend a little bit of time giving you some background to a short history of our project, which we use the shorthand enslaved.org, and then turn things over to my colleague Walter, who will talk in greater detail about some recent publications, particularly related to enslavement among the founding father generation in Virginia, and some data sets which are specific resonance to Monroe as well. So let me put this here so I don't see this myself. All right, so let's move forward. Enslaved.org. Enslaved.org, here's one of the images that we use. Enslaved.org is an open source, open access online discovery tool to explore and reconstruct the lives of the enslaved. Again, open source, open access, online discovery tool to explore and reconstruct the lives of the enslaved. And we put a lot of emphasis on those two first pieces, open source and open access. Open sources, we try to use open source software and programming, not proprietary, so that it can be used and accessed across various platforms, but also various variously resourced institutions and skill sets, but the open access as well. If you go to enslaved.org right now, the website is live. You'll notice that right away you'll land on our landing page. There's no registration, there's no paywall. And that also distinguishes us from some other sites which also have similar data, or at least a similar approach sometimes to especially historical data or historical materials of family history and genealogical work that require either registration and or payment. So here is on the upper left of my screen, it's a screenshot of our landing page. It will look familiar to you in that it has not just our name here, but also a search bar that, like any of the search bars that we're familiar with, both in academic and commercial settings, you can type in whatever you want, and results will come back based on the programming there. But a search bar, which in this particular case suggests that you can type in people, events, and places, but any text string will yield a certain kind of results, and not necessarily the results you're always looking for, but nonetheless, we open this up to any kind of source. We also do have advanced searching as well. I don't know if you can see my cursor on the screen here, but advanced searching, which we'll talk about in a little bit more here. Statement of ethics. We developed about 1 year into our project, really surfacing the ethical considerations that inform our project, inform the work that we do, the why and the for whoms. And this originally was somewhat buried on our site, and we made a decision about 6 months ago to put it really at the top on the landing page here. So I invite you all to explore this. This is a really important issue when we think about not just the work we're doing about enslavement and lives of the enslaved, but also about some of the really pressing considerations about ethics and data that inform our contemporary lives just as much as it informs our relationship with the historical past. The other elements of the homepage here include a search bar, Explore, which has browses stories, which are biographical vignettes of various lives of the enslaved, which are developed in partnership with one of our partner programs, which I'll talk about just a second. Some more information for those of you who are really interested in data and data sciences, ontologies and information studies, as well as some additional new resources for K through 12 educators under our Learn and then About. For those of you who might be interested in supporting our mission, you can do so in various ways, including donating. And this is a tab that will allow you to do so, but also, of course, you can contribute through submitting data sets, which I'll talk about just a second. And there are two main areas here, enslaved.org, which are their main page, and also the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation. I'll talk about in just a second here. On the right, you see some headshots of some of the team members. It's actually, we've changed some folks, so some people have left, some people have joined us. We are based all over the United States and sometimes in partnership with those people across the globe here. Some of us are academics. Some of us are information specialists, archivists, programmers, designers, people interested in media, public humanities as well. So we have a range of different kinds of skill sets and training that bring us together as a team. Since the pandemic, we have not met in person very often, but we used to, but we certainly are in regular contact using various kinds of distributed workflow. Our principal sponsor is the Mellon Foundation, though we have been fortunate to also receive a sponsorship from the National Endowment for the Humanities, among others. And our principal home institutions, University of California, Riverside, where I am today, Michigan State, where Walter is, University of Maryland, my former institution, and Matrix, as you've heard, is the Digital Humanities Center at MSU, which houses our servers and sort of is the data hub here, but it also historically has been invested in digital humanities projects of various kinds here. To give you some sense about the project, our website launched on December 1st, 2020. If you can think back, this is in the pandemic, and that moment in the pandemic when it first seemed that the early wave was waning, but right before I think that was the Delta wave that really hit in that winter there. So it was a moment of some optimism, but yet also the vast majority of us, including those of us in higher education, were working from home. And so it was a very digital moment of work. It was also December. It was also a moment coming out of the summer of the murder of George Floyd and social and racial justice protests. So there was a great deal of interest in Virginia, among many other places, about the various kinds of histories of race and racism, anti-Black racism, but also ways to address and grapple with that. And digital projects, particularly around the histories of enslavement, were one of several different spaces. And there was a great deal of interest that came out of this particular juncture of working from home digitally, and also the context of 2020. And so a little bit to our surprise, but also to some rewarding conversations, we were able to get our word out, or the various kinds of media outlets were able to talk about our project and to general audiences, general public affairs audiences and general interest audiences, which then generated new kinds of interest from Library Journal and from Smithsonian magazines and other places that do a lot of the work of translating academic research into a more popular conversations as well. And so we, again, were quite fortunate to receive, again, an unexpected but also rewarding amount of attention, which was a signal about the hunger, the need for this type of project and what it does and how it can engage academic audiences and those people outside the academy as well. Where we began, this is before we were launched publicly, where we began, and I think you mentioned this, Scott, Slave Biographies, which was a project sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Walter was one of the principals for that, was an earlier attempt, this is from 2012, I believe, to begin to figure out ways to publish data sets, to publish spreadsheets drawn upon the historical research and the archival research on enslavement and slavery. So this was a way to use some of the tools that we're developing around internet and even a little bit on linked open data, relational databases, and make them available and preserve them as well. So Slave Biographies was one of the earlier digital projects that then came to be part of enslaved.org. But it was joined as well by Slave Voyages, which is the most well-known, originated as the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. The Hutchins Center for African American Research, which had been publishing biographies, and the African American biography and the Dictionary of African Biography, and one on Afro-Latin America. Legacies of British Slave Ownership, which is at University of College London, publishing data, doing work on enslavers in the British Empire near the end of the period of enslavement through emancipation. Enslaved Society's Digital Archive, which is based at Vanderbilt, looking particularly at ecclesiastical sources, but not exclusively. So each of these are different projects originating at different times, different funding structures, different kinds of academic and research partnerships. Some are more focused, some of these were more focused on the Anglophone world, some not focused on the Anglophone world, to use evolving and maturing tools of digital tools to explore lives of the enslaved, and particularly in dialogue with archival manuscript resources and sources as well. So those are some of our founding partners that we came together as the origins of our project. And then we more recently, though, have really begun to grapple with how we have to tell a more broad history of the origins of our project. Certainly, some of the origins of our project, which talk about those projects I just talked about, especially this what is now called Slave Voyages, relate to the work of Philip Curtin and the publication of the Atlantic Slave Trade, a census, which was based on archival work and also some early work in machine-readable data sets there. Fogel and Ingerman's work, Time on the Cross. So some of these works that were based in the Academy, the Anglophone Academy in the United States and UK to a certain degree as well, that were published by academic white male scholars in the 60s and 70s, that began in some ways what we now would say would be digital slavery studies, using machine-readable data sets in relationship to questions of numbering, accounting, quantifiable questions about experiences of enslavement. More recently, we're grappling with prehistories that we had not properly accommodated for, and this is some of the work we're rethinking this. And within the African American historical profession, some of that dating back to the 1920s, especially related to things at HBCUs, but also with Carter G. Woodson's work and the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, works from the 20s and even into the 30s, John B. Cade's work, with interviews with formerly enslaved, using various kinds of tools and approaches, sometimes quantifiable, quantitative methods to explore histories of enslavement and experiences there. So we're trying to now kind of grapple with histories in which deal with, one, particularly of Black histories, especially in around HBCUs, and then those for predominantly white institutions. Major research institutions in the 60s and 70s. We have more recent new partners who've joined us, and these particular partners have been brought to us in, with some funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and these include archives and heritage organizations, libraries, who also, outside of higher education, but nonetheless doing deep work to look at their collections, do work to create data sets, make those data sets and that work public, and publish it. And so we also more recently partnered with them to publish new data sets, or sometimes publish old data sets, such as the example of Legacies of Slavery in Maryland, which has been at the Maryland State Archives for, I don't know, 15, 20 years, and to make that more available in this data model that we have that allows searching across various data sets to discover individuals and individual experiences, families, and also do quantitative and comparative work as well. What do we do? Why do we do it? What is important? We center individuals, named individuals in particular, in the study of enslavement, with the premise that enslavement was a human historical phenomena, and it was a historical phenomena of humans, or dehumanization as well. And to humanize that is really important for us to use individuals, and especially named individuals, at the center of the study. This is a little bit different than some of the other projects that I've mentioned before that may look at the slave voyage, or they may look at some sort of other kinds of principal modes or objects of analysis, units of analysis. Our particular principal unit of analysis is the named individual. We use data-driven approach to explore people, and as I've also suggested, the scholarship written about the history of enslavement and also scrubbed from the datasets about a range of things may not always recognize the presence of enslaved individuals. And so we try to work against that. But also, as I've also suggested, some histories of enslavement have also scrubbed the roles of the enslaved, and we try to do work against that grain as well. We preserve historical materials in danger of being lost. This is both work, some of the work on the Slave Society's digital archive that does work to recover endangered manuscript materials in Cuba or Colombia, for instance, but also data sets themselves as digital materials and software matures. We find this problem of data sets and digital technologies degrading and eventually being lost. And so we try to find some ways to preserve historical materials, both in archival and manuscript archival and also digital formats. And new approaches to scholarly publication. And this is particularly through our Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, which invites scholars to publish online, peer review, but also publish data sets, which is a relatively new form of scholarly publication, especially in the humanities. And then we're also quite interested in trying to equip those people outside the academy, maybe some people on this call right now, with the tools to uncover names and life arcs of the enslaved. Oftentimes we get interest from individuals who are doing family history, genealogy, Black family history, who are interested in finding their ancestors. This was not the original audience that we thought of when we really put this project together, but it has become one. And we are trying to anticipate and equip those people in the academy and outside the academy to use tools to understand names and life arcs of the enslaved. What do we do? How do we go about doing it? If you're a contributor, if you would like to publish with us, ideally you approach data work as a powerful, ethical, and often scholarly argument about the past and the possibilities of the archive. What do I mean by this? We treat data not just as something flat or something without argumentation, just facts, but rather itself. Data is powerful. There are ethics of it, and I think our statement of ethics tries to approach that. And oftentimes data is very much about scholarship and scholarly arguments, and I'll show you some examples. The contributor hopefully has gone from this premise that they're working on a scholarly argumentative frame and then using their various tools to extract primary source materials and various kinds of elements of that, and I'll show you some stuff. Structuring that data into extracted data, a spreadsheet, and writing then a descriptive overview of that, a data article, which is prose, and constructing a data dictionary, which is an index or a definition of various kinds of terms. So the three main things that we publish are data sets, spreadsheets, data articles, prose, data dictionaries, which are a dictionary or glossary of terms. How do we do on our end? Then we align a publication with our data model, which you can see from the data side of our website, integrate that data set into our hub. Walter will talk about that a little bit more. Publish the material if it's found to be appropriate, and through a peer review process or internal editorial review, then publish some basic visualizations. So you can see that some of the materials, gender, for instance, gender proportions in a pie chart or a bar graph, and then archive the material for permanent storage at something called Dataverse. And then we talk a lot about trying to publicize the work in both traditional scholarly outlets, but also through social media and other networks. And then when appropriate, try to find within the data some opportunities to tell stories or biographical vignettes. Some guidance here for those of you who are interested in this. We have lots of on our data documentation side, all different kinds of things, ontologies and competency questions, which can help you kind of guide your way through control vocabularies, which is a very important part of what we do on the data information side, but it's also very much informed by ethics. Linked open data, which talks a lot about how things are connected for the data model, and then recommended practices as well. Now, in practice, what does this look like? I'll give you an example. Back in 2022, so last summer, we had a group of 7 fantastic scholars undergraduates recruited from across the United States, who were together for 7 weeks and developed a data set, a data article, and a data dictionary based on one single document that they worked on for 7 weeks. And this is right after they gave their final presentation out here in California in July here. What is that document is right there on the left. One document, 7 weeks, 7 people for 7 weeks worked on one document. But out of that document, which included transcription work and data cleaning, created a data set. Here's a screenshot of that, and then the data dictionary, which is in the lower right, and the data article. And this is a document which was drawn from a historic house in Prince George's County, Maryland, which related to a group of 31, I believe, enslaved individuals who were hired out for labor in the early 1830s in central Maryland. Now, to go to examples of Library of Virginia and so you give you some of the sense of what the students were working with. They didn't work on this specific document, but this gives you some sense of the method. We have a document here from the Library of Virginia, which is this list of slaves and free persons who were sent to the penitentiary from a period 1816 to 1842. You can see the link right here to the manuscript document. You can see a photo capture of that manuscript document on the right. Now, the Library of Virginia had already done some work here to do some transcription work. So if again, we look at the document on the right, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns. Initial work was done and created 3 columns: slave name, age, and owner name, all based on transcriptions of this original document here. But in reality, when we go back to the original document here, we see there's all kinds of challenges in this transcription. The original document includes abbreviations. It includes things like DO or ditto, which is a reference to something right above that. It included certainly more than the 3 columns that were done. So it had a total of all 7 columns here. And those 7 columns had a lot of variety here and a lot of questions of interpretation and ultimately argumentation about that. So what we have done going back with this is work with them to standardize things like dates so that they can be machine readable, to include a full transcription, to separate out some elements that were mushed together in their original transcription, but also I also want to stress here to also help recover. In this particular case here, these 2 Matthews, so this is the 4th and 5th registry here, the 2 Matthews in the original manuscript are senior and junior, entering into the penitentiary on the same day from Cumberland, owners Cape Booker, very different ages though. This strongly suggests that these 2 individuals were related, most likely father, son, and that they were sent to the penitentiary at the same time and had a life experience at least together in that penitentiary until Matthew Sr. died, and then Matthew Jr. at some point was later sold. If we go back to that original earlier version of a transcription here, that relationship of these 2 Matthews, because of transcription choices of the father, senior, junior, was stripped away. So we lose some of the key information which was in the original document, but also the lived experience that these 2 Matthews, most likely we can interpret, had of being father, son, and incarcerated at a certain time, and then seeing the son seeing his father die. So these are some of the work that we do then about the arguments and the practices of transcription, data cleaning, and ultimately publication that go into some of the work. So I'm going to turn things over now to Walter, who's going to talk a little bit more about how we continue to do this kind of work, and particularly in the context of recent publications around Virginia's founding generation. Take it away, Walter.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Daryl. As you've heard, I'm Walter Hawthorne, professor of African history at Michigan State University, and one of the co-PIs on the project. Are you going to continue with the slide?
I'm just going to mute myself.
All right. So we still have some more slides. I can go back to you in a second, Daryl. Are you going to? Here, do you want me to share my screen? Here, let me do this.
Well, Walter, you want to do it that way? Perfect. Okay, great. Yeah.
Okay, and then I'll go back to you.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, everybody. So let me talk a little bit more in depth following what Daryl just said about the project, and also specifically about Monroe and about some recent things we've done with the founding generation in the colonies that become the United States. So here on the screen, what you'll see is, this is actually live internet. This is the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation. And you can Google this, Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation, or JSDP. This is the intake for our project. And anybody who wants to publish with us be it a scholar, representative from a historical site, somebody from a museum, or somebody from the general public. And in addition, we've had undergraduates and graduate students publish with us. What will happen is they'll create one of these data sets that you've seen. Daryl's given you some examples. And they'll write a brief descriptive piece of it, what we call a data article. And if you scroll down here, you can see our recent issue of our journal. It's Revolutionary Contradictions, Slaveholding, and the Virginia Founding Generation. So this is the founding, what we call the founding fathers of the United States. And each one of these that you see down here is one of the articles about some of these people. And you can see we have two here about Monroe. We've got a piece here by Sarah Von Harper and Nancy Stetz on Monroe, and then another piece over here by Lori Kimball on Monroe. So if you're interested in reading more about Monroe, you can go to this, you can go here and visit any one of these. And all you do is click on the piece and you'll see an article that describes the data that Daryl was just showing you. So this is a long description of the data and some of the conclusions that you might draw from that. Scrolling down, if you actually want to see the data set, and I mean, these things aren't terribly exciting to glance at, and we're talking about an Excel spreadsheet, but you can scroll down here and actually download the data set yourself. So you would have all the information that somebody has contributed, somebody has published in the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation. Whoops, just disappeared on me. Here we go. Now, if you Google Monroe in here, you'll see that we have three essays on Monroe. Originally, back in 2020, one of our very early issues, we published a piece by Miranda Burnett and Martin Violet called "Take Them in Families, the Enslaved People of Casa Bianca Plantation, Florida." And that, again, was a 2020 publication. Really fantastically interesting publication. Casa Bianca plantation in Florida was the plantation where Monroe, who was indebted at the time, sold his slaves in order to pay off some of his debts. So this is actually the movement then of slaves from Virginia down to Florida, where they were sold to Casa Bianca plantation. And again, we published this data set and a data article in 2020. What we learned from that data set, if you visit it, is that, and the accompanying data article, is a history, again, of Casa Bianca, which is in Jefferson County, Florida. As I said, it was to Casa Bianca that a deeply indebted James Monroe sold slaves after some negotiation in 1828. We know from Burnett and Violet, who did work on this plantation, on the project, that a great many of the enslaved who are actually on the plantation were indeed enslaved people who had been owned by Monroe. Among them was a couple, Dudley and Eve McGuire, who Burnett and Violet, the creators of this data set, have in the data set. And they describe them in a brief paragraph, and I'll actually quote from them. Dudley and Eve McGuire were sold with 2 children from James Monroe's Highland plantation to Florida in 1828. Their family continued to increase in Florida, eventually increasing, encompassing 6 children: William, Hannah, Patsy, Jane, Ellen, and Richard. Dudley died sometime before 1848. His name does not appear on any plantation documents after that date. Eve most likely was an enslaved domestic for Ellen at Casa Bianca, and Ellen's described earlier as one of the white women on this place. And eventually accompanied her to New Orleans in 1858, suggesting that she traveled then to New Orleans with her. After emancipation, Eve lived with her younger son, Richard, dying sometime in 1870. So that's what we knew in a couple of years ago from this particular publication. on Casa Bianca. And then later, just recently in a recent issue, this issue we just published recently, we have these two data sets about Monroe's holdings of enslaved people in Virginia. And I think one of the wonderful things here then is comparing the data from our two Virginia publications of Monroe's slave holdings in the state to the slave holdings in Casa Bianca. And by making comparisons, by looking for people across the two data sets, what we can begin to do is to sketch fuller histories of these people who we know a little bit about from the Casa Bianca data. So, for example, what we derive from the data set from Sarah Bon Harper and Nancy Stetz is that in December, is more information about Dudley and Eve McGuire. We encounter Dudley first at Oak Hill in 1808 in an inventory. He's listed there as a skilled agriculturalist, somebody also skilled in animal husbandry and in forestry. And he was valued at the time, 1808, at 110 pounds and owned by Joseph Jones. In 1809, a bill of sale has Dudley being listed, Dudley and Eve McGuire then listed as having been sold to Monroe for $531. An 1826 record, so jumping ahead then, and the data set, has the couple at Highland with an unnamed child and a son, William McGuire, who we know was their eldest son. And at the time, they were, again, at Highland. This is to say that bringing together under one roof multiple data sets about the enslaved who were bought, held, and sold by James Monroe allows us to facilitate the telling of histories of enslaved people, these richer, these more detailed histories. In addition to Dudley and Eve, we have at least 10 other enslaved individuals who we think are probably matches in these three data sets. Among them, I'll just give you one other example. We have records of Toby and Betsy with their son Garrett and daughter Lady in Albemarle in 1826. These enslaved people also show up in the data set for Casa Bianca, and we know then that they were sold in 1828 and made their way down to Florida. There, we find out that Toby and Betsy had 7 children, and Betsy, we know, spun and wove wool from the plantation sheep. She was later sold to a lawyer in Tallahassee named Robert Williams, therefore separated from the rest of her family. These are just a couple of examples then of stories that we can tell by stringing together information in what seem to be, these bland data sets, but by extracting data from archival sources, from wills, from inventory, from sales records, from other descriptions, putting them in these data sets, we can begin to make these matches. Daryl, can you share your screen now, and I'll move ahead to the next slide.
So you should need to stop sharing yours. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
1 second. And here we go. Is that good, Walter?
Yeah, that's good. Go on to the next couple of slides. So we've done that, and I've done that. So go ahead. You can go to the next one. Do you want to pick it up here, Daryl?
Sure. So we talked some about how individuals can contribute, and Walter's has given us some insight into how individuals have contributed. Some of the folks that these authors of these various data sets are at heritage organizations like Highland. Some of them are independent scholars. I think 1 or 2 is a graduate student. So you can see people from various institutional settings who are doing the kind of work that develops data sets and then contributes them for peer review and publication here. But we're also quite interested in building out more skills, building out this community of scholars, museum professionals, archivists, even independent researchers, family historians who are interested in using data sciences and slavery studies to explore the lives of the enslaved in various ways here. So we have two different institutes which advance some of these efforts. First, you can see here on the left, is sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities. This is a summer institute on data-informed methods in slavery studies, which will take place in the middle of June to middle of July, 2 weeks in person and then 2 weeks virtual. This is mainly for people in higher education, but this includes graduate students as well as faculty members. And so the application deadline for that, Walter, is I think March 1st, I believe. It's coming up in March, a little bit of time. And then we have, as I already signaled earlier, a different program for undergraduate researchers on a summer research opportunity program, or SROP. That was in person last year and will be in person again this year, 6 weeks in Maryland at the University of Maryland, and then 1 week Scholars Institute at UCR Palm Desert Center here in Southern California. So these are both different communities here, but both of them exposing scholars in various stages of the scholarly journey to practices and principles and challenges in data-informed slavery studies. In both cases, hoping that the work then leads itself to not just thinking out the skills, but also publication in our data set, in our journal, and in some cases, maybe also development of some new stories, some new biographies as well, and more connections. And then here we have, before we turn things over to questions, our link to the main project, enslaved.org. If you'd like to contribute to the journal, the website, or the URL is right there, and then our email. And I believe I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Walter and I are more than pleased to take your questions. I think we're good on time. 40 minutes. Look at that.
Hey, look at that. That's show business. That's great. Come out, hit the mark. Fascinating presentation, gentlemen. And for someone like me who used to be the tech guy in the office when we still used MS-DOS and pre-mouse, the degree of to me of the complexity of the task that you've undertaken by itself is interesting and would be very daunting to me, because you have got, with all of these records, clearly such a volume of material in so many different potential original formats, and how much of a challenge was it to develop the standards by which you could take whatever is out there, and I know you were describing the process, but putting all this together, how much of a formative effort was there in coming up with the standards and the practices you needed to turn this into a workable site?
So I'll start that question. That's a great question. I would say it was a formidable undertaking. As Daryl mentioned earlier, we actually began this work way back in 2010, and here we are in 2023. One of the challenges, Scott, as you've mentioned, is that the project really is about extracting data from primary sources. So we take a primary source, or a contributor to our project takes a primary source, and they extract information, the name of somebody, that's fairly obvious, a date, but then other information that really needs to be standardized. And it is that standardization that is the difficult thing. Because ultimately what the project is all about is publishing data sets and allowing users to search over multiple data sets. So we need to have standardization of some terms in order for users to search across those things. And that has, to put things in our terms, what we've had to do is to create what we call a controlled vocabulary. So that we can control the language that goes into data sets, so that folks do this in a very standardized way. So one example, you might have somebody who is described in a document as a washerwoman, somebody else is described as a washer of clothes, somebody else is described as a laundress, somebody else is described in some other term. So what do you do with that? Does the recorder, the original recorder of the data set, might use the original language that's in the document. But in order for us to search across all of the multiple possibilities here, we need to have one standardized term so that we can, so that the computer itself can recognize that. And that has to do with our controlled vocabulary. So anybody who's interested in undertaking this kind of work can visit our website. One of the slides that Daryl had earlier showed this. And we make very transparent and open the controlled vocabulary that we use, so that anyone who is interested in doing this, be they a scholar, somebody who works in an archive, somebody who's at a museum, or just a member of the general public, can see sort of what the accepted process is for this, and create a data set so that it can really integrate in with others.
Does that vocabulary continue to evolve as you go forward?
I mean, that's a great, I'm going to use an example that Walter gave of washerwomen. So we had a version 1 of our controlled vocabulary, which is based on the best minds that were brought to the table from those original partner projects. And we came up with a set of occupations and a set of terms, including those original terms for roles was slave and master. And we recognized very early on that we were both at a cusp moment, and some of this informed by some things about 2020, about some major linguistic, language, ideological, interpretive shifts, enslaved, or rather from slave to enslaved or enslaver. But also much we just did not, in the first round, did not do enough to recognize the really significant gendered roles of enslaved laborers' work, including women's work. And so laundress was not one of the occupations, even though that's like standard occupation for enslaved women across so many different slave societies. So in our version 2, we had to do a lot of work to recognize, like, we had gaps in language choice, but also gaps in some of the things related to contemporary scholarship about families and about reproduction and about sexuality and about labor and about gender, among many other things, that led to a pretty significant update, which is now version 2, and we are just making some much more modest but nonetheless significant tweaks for version 3. All of them will be published. You'll be able to see them and track them over time to see. And that's work on the back end that seems to be soul-sucking and invisible, but yet is central to not just the discovery part, but also to this interpretive and ethical work that is around data.
So that, if I understand it, then each time you publish a new version of the vocabulary, does that sort of reset the search parameters in a way that would capture, for instance, adding laundress? So presumably then you're going to find
and the programmers get pretty upset with us. They're like, do you really, really, really want to do this? Because they have to do some programming again. So there's a program logistics side to this as well. But yes.
Well, and that, I mean, that's in a way, when you get right down to it, that's sort of, obvious. You have to update the card catalog, if I can put that in an old boomer terminology that people will get. I mean, that's always something that would have to be organic, I would think, as the more thought process goes into this, and as the volume of records grow, as you do dive more deeply into it, and even things that might seem on the surface like, oh yeah, why wouldn't we have had that? It's human system here, and I think the longer you do it, the more brains are being applied to it. Ideally, the more well crafted it is over time.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And the other reality, Scott, is that we get data sets from people, and they have terms that we hadn't thought of. They're exploring a side of slavery that we didn't have records for earlier, and now we are faced with the data set. So we have to update as you said, update the card catalog. We have to update the controlled vocabulary.
Well, and even as we, in a very contemporary time, see an evolution in usage from slave to enslaved, as you say, there are period terms that practically nobody would use. It chattel, I would think, is one. Obviously, people don't really use it today. But in the 19th century, the 18th century, you're going to see references to that term in various kinds of language. And so you have to be conversant in archaic language as well as still evolving more contemporary cultural language. That put me in mind of something else. When you're talking about, you started this in 2010 and you talked about some of the technical or linguistic evolutions. There's been a lot of ideological evolution in our country over the subject of slavery, of race relations, of memory and interpretation. And I wonder, in putting this process together and getting it out there for the public, have you encountered any resistance, or have you had criticism of your work based or in some way reflective of how our national dialogue is kind of going?
We've had a range of things. Let me give you some examples. We've had some people querying, if not challenging, that somehow we're engaged in some work about reparations. And that's not really the case. It's not intentional. Certainly the work that we do, and we're in dialogue with things which might inform questions about reparations and identifying. So that's out there. We have heard from, and this is on social media, but I think it's important to recognize out to kind of general conversations. Do we have the right to recover and make public names of enslaved family individuals and families that themselves went through trauma, and then also may re-traumatize the descendants of those individuals, or generally African Americans in this particular case? Do we have the right to do so? And so some of this speaks to our ethics. This ethics statement we try to grapple with as scholars. We do scholarship and we have certain kind of ethical standards there, but we're also making, especially centering names, making individuals, and those individuals who were in families and communities who are connected, if one does the genealogical work, and even if they don't do the genealogical work in the same community, to contemporary individuals who feel trauma, potentially feel that this is not up for public consumption or open, it shouldn't be open access. And so we've also found some criticisms from that side as well. And then the normal things about wonky websites and all kinds of user experience.
Right.
So Scott, it is the I'm a historian, and time and place matters. I was recently in a conference at Stanford, and the topic was databases like these. Daryl's referred to ethics, but the varying ethics in different places. Now we're a website about slavery in the Atlantic broadly, and also the Indian Ocean, African slavery. We have data sets for Brazil. We have data sets for the United States. We have data sets for the Caribbean. We could potentially in the future have data sets about named enslaved individuals in Africa itself. Now, one of the issues in Africa is there is to this day a stigma attached to an association with slavery. So a family association with slavery would still to this day carry a stigma. And a lot of the conversation then in this particular conference had to do with the ethics of publishing the names of enslaved people whose relatives today might be able to be attached to some of those names in a data set. Now, the calculation, the ethics of doing this in the United States might be different, but certainly I think when you're thinking about slavery, which is this global institution, and African slavery particularly, which was something that happened in the United States, in Latin America, in Africa itself, also in the Indian Ocean. When we're thinking about the ethics of publishing names, we need to think about the particularities of time and place and what descendant communities. Daryl was talking about, do we have the right? And one of our commitments is to work with and consult with descendant communities about these data sets, about this history, because it is very much their history. And if there is any indication, as there is in West Africa, that descendant communities might have some resistance to the publication of names, then that's something that we would want to avoid. Now, we also face the opposite, that is particularly in the United States, where people thank us for publishing names because they very much want to trace, people very much want to trace their own family history, and having websites like this allow people to tell that history that they couldn't tell otherwise.
And on your site, for those that might want to follow that up further, there is your statement of ethics that goes into a number of paragraphs about much of what you were just saying, I think, in terms of where where this project fits within an ethical structure. I'm wondering too, do you have, and we do have a question I want to put out to you, but do you have an advisory board? Do you have a brain trust that you utilize? I mean, not to diminish what the two of you are doing as principal investigators, but if for no other reason than cover, I would think you would want to have some other interaction with folk in academia or other areas. So I see nodding. So what have you got?
Two things on that, and then Daryl can jump in. We have a very broad and diverse team that we work with. We have frequent meetings with that team. And that team is represented by individuals holding multiple roles at multiple universities. They all bring incredible knowledge about things that, well, I don't want to speak for Daryl, but I will. Daryl and I don't know much about, which is the programming of something, or how to put together a data dictionary, how to put together, how to keep track of metadata and controlled vocabularies. I mean, we have this incredible team that does that, and then we have a team of scholars as well. Mm-hmm. And we also have an advisory board. We started off with a sort of a founding board, a board that was helping us guide the project early on. And that has evolved into an advisory board that we meet with a couple of times a year, and they give us input on things. Now, in addition to that, the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation is a peer-reviewed journal. So everything that we publish, we send out to multiple readers who read the materials, comment on them anonymously, give feedback to folks who have made these data sets and written these data articles. They give comments about, things you might think about to make this a stronger piece of scholarship, and whether or not we as a journal, we editors should publish this. Does it rise to the standard that we would expect of a peer review publication?
Now, have you received input after putting something out through the journal that if it comes back to you that, oh, hey, we're not sure what's the source for this, or why was this conclusion drawn? Or, I mean, will you go back in and then work either with the authors or somehow revise that submission in some way? Will you?
That came up, and this would be, I think, applicable to any peer-reviewed journal. I mean, you refer back to the original contributor to engage in that, but we also have to make sure that we've done the due diligence, that that's proper, that our responsibilities have been met. But we also recognize that there's plenty of room for debate and disagreement and interpretive differences about that. And that is what scholarship is in part. We become a platform and a vehicle for that, but we also can't resolve everything. Now, if it turns out that something is really erroneous or is done certainly unethically, we haven't come across this situation right now yet, but it's possible, then we would have to make some editorial decisions about how to address that, correct it if that's the appropriate way, mark it another way, learn our best. There's a lot of different ways that we would do it. I would say you see is also a little bit of the evolution of this site in dialogue with questions and needs. So we didn't start out thinking that K through 12 is a particularly a high priority, but K through 12 educators kept asking us, we want some materials. And so we're still not where we need to be to address some interests that we have through K through 12, but we do now have some K through 12, some modules which are focused on a K through 12 audience. So that's in dialogue with questions, concerns, calls. Of course, we need to find, that would be ideally to find some partners who are really K through 12 education specialists and some funders who would be able to build out those areas.
And K-12 educators have been particularly attracted. We have, Daryl mentioned this early, but if you look at the enslaved.org platform and scroll down a little bit, we have a section called Stories. And what the Stories section is well, I read a little bit about the Dudley and Eve McGuire. That's the sort of thing that could be spun into a story. If we have information that is particularly rich on an individual or a couple or a family, then and from these data sets, then what the contributors can do is to spin some of that out into actually, several paragraphs, a couple of pages, but what we call a story, a short history about a particular individual. And we've got dozens of those up on the website right now. And K-12 educators have been particularly attracted to those because these are histories of enslaved people that you really can't find anywhere else. I mean, ordinarily what we would read, of course, is the history of James Monroe. And a mention that James Monroe held X number of slaves in this period and X number of enslaved people in this period. But what we're able to do in these stories is actually spin out, as I demonstrated, by piecing together fragments of information, life histories of individuals. And that is particularly attractive, I think, to K-12 educators who can use that kind of material in the classroom.
We had a question that actually touches on something I was thinking of too, and I'll pose it in two parts. The question that came in is, would it be possible to complement your data with DNA data to get more comprehensive information? And that kind of chimes into what I was thinking of. Is there a connection, either theoretical or actual, that you've thought of with something like an Ancestry.com or one of the other, now granted, for-profit sites, but there is such an explosion in interest in genealogical sites, and I'd wonder whether there is any potential interaction that you've thought about or may occur. And of course,
Let me start that one. I have a great little, then I'll hand it up to you, Daryl.
DNA and ancestry.
Go ahead.
So the first book I wrote about rice on the Upper Guinea Coast was really a history of a group of people known as Balanta, the Balanta of the Upper Guinea Coast. And I spent years there collecting oral history and ultimately writing that book about Balanta. So if you Google Balanta today, my name pops up on the first page. And it is the case that African Americans doing genealogical research, sometimes they're doing genetic research. Sometimes Balanta are a relatively small ethnic group, but people doing genetic research will sometimes have Balanta pop up on that printout that you get. And I've had several individuals go to the internet, Google Balanta, find my name, and email me and ask me some questions. And the short answer then to your question is yes, you can do this sort of matching of your genetic testing with some of this data that's available in data sets. And what I usually will advise people to do is to find out where you think you were from, your first ancestors in the United States. You know your Balanta, you know you're in the United States. If you know you can trace some of your ancestry to South Carolina, then there are websites out there. There's one called Slave Voyages, which has documentation for every known slave ship voyage across the ocean. If we visit that website, we find out that there was only a handful of ships that came from the area where Balanta are today across the ocean to South Carolina. So there's one piece of data right there. If you've got that ethnic group that you know you can trace yourself to, then you can use some other websites that are out there, and particularly Slave Voyages, to make some inferences. Chances are it was some of these ships. You then might be able to pair that with some genealogical research that you've done with some primary source data. If you can place some of your relatives in South Carolina at a particular time, then maybe you can begin to make some of those matches. So I think that's a particularly promising field of inquiry for people interested in their own family histories. It does require some digging, and the thing that I love about it as a historian, it requires a knowledge of history. You've got to understand the history of these places, the history of the Atlantic trade and enslaved people, the reason that certain documentation was made, and you've really got to turn yourself into a historian in order to pull that off.
And as far as Ancestry or any of the other places, of course,
we haven't. We've kind of, to be honest,
I don't want to blow the lid
off.
We've
studied avoidance of those kinds of things, in part because, as you just made a brief reference, those are registration and pay, and so we have a fundamentally different approach to the work that we do. In terms of the relationship to open access and open source. We also fundamentally are based on materials which are drawn from archival research. And so using DNA or some other archaeological or something, there are other ways, of course, to approach this. So the world is big enough. Slavery is, the vastness of the slave experience and all of its different legacies has, generated a tremendous amount of evidence, much of that fractured evidence, based on the violence of enslavement itself and racism and everything. But the world is big. We cannot address it all, and we're not trying to be that one site. Nonetheless, I think, as Walter suggested, encourage and equip folks to do the kind of work, to piece it together from various sources. Fantastic. And then they can draw their conclusions about whether they, descended from a particular slave voyage or if they experienced in South Carolina relative to something in West Africa, et cetera. But that's not where we're going. I think probably anywhere in the near future. We have lots of great challenges and great opportunities. And the DNA part is not one we're really going to pursue.
Sure. Well, we have had an hour and slightly more flyby. Walter Hawthorne, Darrell Williams, want to thank you. I also want to note that you have now joined the ranks of Sarah Bon Harper, Nancy Stepps, Lori Kimball, Wynn Saffer, Miranda Burnett, and Martin Violet, who have all done programs for the James Monroe Museum in the past. So you've joined that club, and it was so nice to see their names gratifying, folks that we've worked with before, and I'm sure we'll again. Even the Betty lamp that you had on the one page from Oak Hill, James Monroe's home, one that's in private hands today. We have ones in the collection of the James Monroe Museum that I'm quite certain were made by the same enslaved artisan, and it's one of the few tangible artifacts we have that we can use to interpret the impact of the enslaved workers in Monroe's lifestyle, one of the ones that we can attribute more directly to an enslaved person. So we thank you for giving us this overview and some of the relevant examples of James Monroe in your work. We will encourage folks, as I say, both to go to your website, enslaved.org. Also, in a few days, a week or so, we'll have this program archived on the YouTube channel of the James Monroe Museum. And so we invite people to go back to it, to review it, share it with friends, to try and get more word out about your work. Any final comments or thoughts from you, gentlemen?
I want to thank you, and thank those of you who are in the museum world and the heritage organizations. These have been, we've had really fruitful conversations at Riversdale Historic House in Prince George's County. Tudor Place Walter and I will be giving a presentation at Tudor Place in Washington, D.C. Shortly. We've been talking to folks, as you see some of the work at Oak Hill and Scotchtown and other places. So this is a really, really interesting, fruitful set of conversations we're having right now with heritage organizations and museums. I really appreciate the work that those museum professionals, curators, exhibition educators, et cetera, are engaging with this material. So thank you.
Thank you.
Certainly. And the reviews are in from the audience. Great program. Amazing. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And certainly it has been a pleasure. Again, Walter Hawthorne, Darrell Williams, thank you very much. Lindsay, thank you. Scott and AV for keeping us technically in line. For the James Monroe Museum, I'm Scott Harris. Thank you and good evening.
And we're going to end the live.